The subject of the lesson is God, and the golden text sets up the whole sense of it with, now acquaint thyself with him and be at peace, with a great emphasis on our understanding God, our relationship to him, and the end result is peace. In the responsive reading, it is the last verse. Lord, you will establish peace for us, for you have also done all our works in us. It gave me first strong sense of peace in the lesson, for that second line stresses that all the works are done through our reflection of him. That is, all our works in us. The Christ is ever active in our human experience to have us recognize our spiritual reality. And that was such a great comfort to me. Yes, God will establish peace, but he is working through the Christ in us. And it's awfully nice to have him as a companion in this spiritual journey. And it brought to mind Jesus' statement at one time, the Son can do nothing of himself but what he seeth the Father do. And that sense of the active Christ, which is more and more coming to my thought with the lessons and bringing a great deal of comfort in this troubled world. Okay, now in section 1, we add to the word of peace the word still, with, of course, the later story of Elijah being such a keynote in the lesson. We're told in section 1, be still and know that I am God. And we hear later on from Elijah the still small voice of God. When I read that each day, came to me hymn 46, which was a terrible help. I mean, a wonderful help. Yes, not too cool. It's the manna, day by day, the manna fell. But it was particularly, I think it's verse 3. Lord, my times are in thy hand. All my sanguine hopes have planned. To thy wisdom I resign, and would mold my will to thine. That is so reassuring that my times are in thy hand. Even these troubled times are in his hand, and all my very best hopes have planned for me, for I'm your child. And to thy wisdom I resign. Now that is the big task for us in this earthly preparatory world that Mrs. Eddy speaks of. And would mold my will to thine. And again, the Elijah story will have a lot to say about that idea. Let's see. In section 1, Science and Health, citation 6, and all in all forever near. That is the stress of God, our knowledge of God, which comes to us through study of Christian Science. And it took me back to my Sunday school days, my very early Sunday school days. We had a very special little saying that reminded us of our position as God's child. God is closer than hands and feet. I still remember my Sunday school teacher talking about God is closer than hands and feet, and there is no spot where God is not. So that was a wonderful base. Christian Science Sunday School is so important. Let's see. Section 2. Citation 5, excuse me. And he said, my presence shall go with thee, and I will give thee rest. So now we have peace and stillness and rest. And that brought to mind that wonderful hymn, 124, how gentle God's commands. The story of Elijah stresses the gentleness of God, the grace of God that lets us, in verse 3, his goodness stands approved, unchanged from day to day. This is my favorite. I drop my burden at his feet and bear a song away. It's wonderful. And often, when I need to get close to God, I sing hymns. Mrs. Eddy says that's a wonderful way to put aside fear. And this reminds us that you can bear a song away, or in a song you can reach your spiritual identity. For he hath given us of his Spirit, repeating what was said in section 1, that the Christ is working in us, always. Okay, let's see. Now we get to section 2 and 3, and that to me is the outstanding heart of the demonstration of what this lesson on God means. She says in section 2, the 9th citation, the term Lord as used in our version of the Old Testament is often synonymous with Jehovah and expresses the Jewish concept, not yet elevated to deific apprehension through spiritual transfiguration. The Jewish concept of Jehovah through spiritual transfiguration. The word gradually, Mrs. Eddy says, approaches a higher meaning. Excuse me. The human sense of deity yields to the divine. And we come then to this wonderful story of Elijah. It's one of my favorites. Elijah was having a very difficult time because of the worship of Baal. And I studied some definitions and background on Baal. And it was really the earth god that was thoroughly materialistic in worship and in nature. And it had spread throughout so many towns and villages and nations, in fact. And it was deeply in the religious practice of the Jews. And this was very upsetting to Elijah, so that he says he's the only one left who's a prophet of the one true God. Elijah, the Tishbite, he was of the land of Gilead. He was a Bedouin. He is one of the most romantic figures, dynamic figures in the Old Testament. It might be interesting to you to picture him during this citation in the Bible. He had long hair that flowed down his back. He wore a loincloth and sometimes a mantle of sheepskin. He had been battling Baal, and he had this quality of appearing suddenly which apparently is a Bedouin quality, so that when you read the text about him, he shows up suddenly to Ahab or suddenly to Jezebel and disappears fast, which I think is kind of interesting. But the first citation, or citation 8, in section 3 says, I will hear what God the Lord will speak, for he will speak peace unto his people and to his saints. And then he has the experience of fleeing for his life and ending up in a cave. We probably all know this experience. And he was told by God to go to the cave. He said, God said, go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind. But the Lord was not in the wind, and after the wind, the earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake, and after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire, and after the fire, a still, small voice. Voice of peace. Notice that stillness, idea of rest. So the way I had looked upon it from Elijah's story and the rest of Kings, and also before this event, is that all these commitments or presentations of power in material things like wind and earthquake and fire are memories of what Baal stands for, passing through Elijah's thought. But he was, in this instance, brought to recognize that God is not working in the material world the way Baal is, but rather in the spiritual world, a still small voice. And I think it's an example of what Mrs. Eddy has said about the Jewish concept not yet elevated to deific apprehension through spiritual transfiguration. But eventually, Elijah will be thus transfigured. We know that Elijah is the prophet, along with Moses and Jesus, who through in the transfiguration, through spiritualization, appears to three of the disciples, Elijah, Moses, and Jesus, so that he took a great step to go from the worship of Jehovah like God toward the still, small, infinite power of the one expressed spiritually, because, of course, he also is the prophet who, after this experience and his taking up with Elisha as his successor, is taken up into heaven in chariot of fire and doesn't look upon ordinary death. So he's a pivotal figure. But this idea of being dominated in thought by memories of evil is handled beautifully in a article in the Anthology 3 on page 15. And I would suggest reading it for our current times. It's called Evil, and it has a semicolon after, a colon after it, with a quote, "No portion, no right, nor memorial." And it's a quote from Mrs. Eddy, of course. Evil has no portion, no right, nor memorial, so that there is nothing in evil that should remain in memory, has no memorial, should indicate power, it has no right, and it has no portion of your life. You are completely spiritual. And it's about Nehemiah and the building of the temple, or the wall that fell down. And it concludes with wonderful sense of the transition that must take place in our thinking that went through Elijah's thinking. We are effectual workers as we manifest Nehemiah-like qualities, always letting God direct our careers. Only then can we safely advance and flourish. Mrs. Eddy says in Science and Health, eternal harmony, perpetuity, and perfection constitute the phenomena of being. Governed by the immutable and eternal laws of God, whereas matter and human will, intellect, desire, and fear are not the creators, controllers, nor destroyers of life or its harmonies. That's from No and Yes, page 10 and 11. But it's built so beautifully, the article, that it's really not a good idea to quote from it. But if possible, you can read it and parallel it with Elijah's experience. Okay. Then I think the perspicacity, the understanding of our committee that makes up these Bible lessons is so beautifully shown in some of the sections that follow. Because we are going through, and I have learned this from doing Bible study and going to Bible study from other denominations, that there is a great sense that Armageddon is upon us, that we are going to be destroyed by, some call it an antichrist, some call it just predicted power of evil. Now, Mrs. Eddy says, God is not the author of mortal discords. This is citation 12. Therefore, we accept the conclusion that discords have only a fabulous existence, are mortal beliefs which divine love and truth destroy. There is no vapid fury of mortal mind expressed in earthquake, wind, wave, lightning, fire, bestial ferocity. And this so-called mind is self-destroyed. And that's one of the reasons I think that the lesson is just so wonderful right now, because our nation, for which we are to pray, our nation seems to be going through such a destructive phase, with so much hate being expressed over the election, with so much submission to money, to materiality, that this will buy us peace, this will buy us power. The dire predictions that the middle class is disappearing. And we have to remember that we are governed by the divine economy, which appeared in a lesson several weeks ago. So, section 3, 4, and 5, I think, stress that kind of thing. That it starts out in section 4 with, in the synagogue there was a man which had a spirit of an unclean devil. So they set the sense of not a physical healing here, essentially, but a mental healing. That the evil was recognized, destroyed, but it did not destroy the man who had thought it to be his life. The arguments to be used, this is citation 19, in curing insanity, which is a kind of thing that's going on right now. Insane, not healthful, is what insanity means, are the same as in other diseases, namely the impossibility that matter, brain can control or derange mind, can suffer or cause suffering. Also the fact that truth and love will establish a healthy state, guide and govern mortal mind. We have to think about the government of mortal mind, or the thought of the patient, and destroy all error, whether it is called dementia, hatred, or any other discord. So I think our work is cut out for us, that we are to look at this terrible upheaval of unemployment, of loss of identity, of increased crime because of this joblessness and this sense of no good future at all, and just get back to basics. God is good. He is all. He is all in all. I think that's so important. That came to me so clearly about this, that God worketh in us, that Christ works in us, and his commands and his direction are gentle. Just the fact that so much of the political talk uses the word fight. I will fight for your rights. I will fight for this. I will fight for that. Hey, fight is not peace. Fight has nothing to do except to hand over everything to God. God conducts the battle. We don't. And to, this wonderful direction to us in section 6. During this final conflict, wicked minds will endeavor to find means by which to accomplish more evil. But those who discern Christian science will hold crime in check. They will aid in the ejection of error. They will maintain law and order and cheerfully await the certainty of ultimate perfection. Mrs. Eddy had predicted this consummation draws nearer, and gives the remedy that we will hold our spiritual nature as the truth and that of our fellow man. And your fruits, citation 28, will prove what the understanding of God brings to man. So I found the lesson terribly, terribly up to date in what our needs are in our prayers. And that wonderful blessing in section 7, I think it's citation 23, the God of love and peace shall be with you. What more can we ask? So that's what I have to say about the lesson, okay? Well, I don't know that it's terrific, but I just admire, should you go around admiring lessons, but I admire this lesson.